Yeah.
Hello and hello again. For those who are joining us, welcome to Afterlife Apologetics. Here we like to discuss things like near death, deathbed experiences, and how they relate to the Christian apologetic arguments. And we are ultimately in pursuit of truth. That's what we want, ladies and gentlemen. We want to know the truth and engage with the arguments from all the different perspectives. So if you're new here, welcome. We would love to have a deep discussion with you about life and all the different things that come along with that. And that is kind of really the most ethereal intro I have ever done for this podcast,
Quite
Steve.
ethereal, quite
But,
ethereal. Just let me sit back and reflect for a while.
but so today, guys, a few quick awesome announcements. So I gotta brag on Steve. First off, I have to brag on myself because I saw the genius of this man that God gave him many years ago before, and now
What can I say?
he's getting recognized in all these cool ways. And so, in all honesty, it's truly wonderful to see Steve, to see the recognition start to kind of come your way. And ladies and gentlemen, Steve has been he's going to be able to present his paper to the Evangelical Philosophical Society, not to be confused with the Evangelical Theological Society. Hopefully that'll be the next place you get to present the paper, right? And then from there, you're also being interviewed by Lee Strobel for an upcoming book he's doing on deathbed experiences. And now William Lane Craig is considering your work as well for some of his interests in near-death experiences. I
Yeah,
get
and
all
I'd
that
say
right?
that William Lane Craig, he was just studying out some obscure thing in his, I believe, for one of his books on philosophical theology, and he said, "Hey, near-death experience may feed into this," and so I was going to give him a few of my books. So we'll see if that goes anywhere. I studied under Dr. Craig at Trinity. I think he's a fine person, a wonderful researcher. So we'll see if that goes anywhere. But we're just trying to get people on board with this study. It seems like it's not really been taken seriously um, by Christians. For several different reasons, and we're trying to get people to actually look at the research.
Yeah, and again, a lot of that has been really foundational work by you, Steve. And so, for anybody who would love to engage with some of Steve's work, just head on over to Amazon, look up J. Steve Miller, proof of. I'm trying to remember the. Yeah, I'm getting all the books in my head mixed up right now. Proof of the heaven
Near death
experiences.
experiences as evidence for the existence of God in
Yeah, that's his
heaven
first one. That one right
is
there.
the first one.
Yeah,
All right.
if you guys are looking for, I would say that Steve is really great in terms of a lot of the academic stuff I've read. Steve is the best at kind of keeping his work academic, but also in the same token, communicating it in a way that's enjoyable to read. So he's a good communicator. He doesn't give himself enough credit for that, but he's definitely a good communicator in his writings. And so I would highly recommend that to anyone, especially if you're looking at this from a Christian framework and you're trying to make sense of it, or maybe you're not looking at it from a Christian framework. Maybe you're looking at it from a skeptic perspective. Maybe you're an atheist or agnostic or something to that effect. Either way, highly recommend you guys go check it out. Steve's going to be able to present some awesome stuff in the near future, and I'm excited to read his paper because I think it's one of the. I always love work that takes a lot of information and it catches you up really fast on that information in an interesting way. And I think Steve's paper that he's going to be presenting at the Evangelical Philosophical Society is one of those works that really kind of captures a lot of the important aspects of near death and deathbed experiences in a succinct way that kind of makes you feel like you're informed without having to go through all the history that's there. So kudos to you, Steve, for all that. So enough patting him on the back, because can't have his ego explode over there. Let's talk about today. So today we are going to be engaging with an article from the Guardian and a rebuttal that we're going to be kind of jumping back and forth probably between discussing the rebuttal that was written by a gentleman by the name of, I had it was Mark. Let me give me his last name. Mr. Mark Mahan. I'm sorry, Mark, if I just butchered your last name. So feel free to let me know how to properly pronounce that. But I have linked his rebuttal argument, and I've linked the article from the Guardian, which is the new science of death. There's something happening in the brain that makes no sense. Okay, and so I'm going to give you the long skinny of it, And then, Steve, we can kind of get into discussing it. I know you've got some probably great notes prepared that I'm going to get to riff off of, so yay me. But I really want you guys to, if you have any thoughts, or maybe we mischaracterize something, as usual. That's why we want to post the sources in the description so that you guys can actually go read them, and then come back here and say, hey, you guys said this, and this is really what they were trying to articulate, or whatever. And as usual, we'll engage with those. I do have an episode planned where Steve and I are going to engage with some of the questions that we got throughout the glove series. But to be honest with you guys, I just did not have that prepared today, and I wanted to give Steve a little more time to be prepared with that too. So we just want to make sure that we're coming to you guys ready to have a strong conversation around those questions and give you guys some good content to kind of roll around in your mind. For now, we do want to deal with this article because this is one of the more recent attempts. This article was published April of 2024, and so this is one of the more recent attempts to more or less discredit near-death experiences as just a physical phenomenon of essentially the brain goes haywire at death, and some crazy concoction of body chemicals is basically pumped into the brain. And so it's safe to assume that those chemicals are what is generating these near-death experiences. That would you say that that's kind of a safe summary of the article?
I think so. Let's give them the
Or accurate?
title. Something happening in the brain that makes no sense, by Alex Blasdell, Blasdel. I probably butchered that as well. Again, it's April 2nd, 2024. So this is very recent.
Yeah.
And I should mention that I really like reading The Guardian. It's kind of middle to middle left, as far as politically speaking. But I like to hear from another perspective. It's coming out of England. And in 2011, it was the fifth most popular newspaper website in the world with 8.2 million unique visitors per month. So when something like this comes out, you're going to have naturalists and people quoting such an article on their sites. They get all excited about it because it's like, okay, this is giving it's pretty much showing that near-death experiences are something that can be explained purely naturally, and people quote this and get it out there. So we need to be familiar with it and have and see, are they saying something significant we should be aware of? We're not out to destroy the article, we're out to find the truth behind it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so a lot of the article starts with kind of a general introduction to near-death experiences, and they try to give kind of a brief history of previous experiences. And at that point, it's an interesting read for some aspects. I felt just, okay, cool, they're giving us some background, but it wasn't really the meat of the article. The meat of the article's not until like 80% of the way in, I felt. Or at least trying to lay the foundation for this argument that he wanted to articulate on behalf of the researcher.
Can I speak to their history as they laid it out?
Sure.
I think that what it presents is the history of near-death studies. It gives some earlier reports, but basically focuses on Moody starting it out in 1975 with Life After Life. And then it says there are three types of researchers basically that have explored these themes of near-death experiences. They're the spiritualists, which it says, well, this includes some evangelical Christians who try to take these experiences and make something about the afterlife and how it confirms Christianity or whatever. I've not really seen that many of those, especially in the as far as the big time researchers. Sabom definitely tried to tie it into Christianity and see how they fit there. But a lot of the main researchers, like Moody starting out and then going into others, they were really people who started out like Moody came from an atheist family. He didn't believe in all this stuff starting out. Bruce Grayson didn't believe in all this stuff studying out. Sabom didn't believe in near-death experiences. In fact, most of these seem to, Bruce Grayson, they seem to think that everything could be explained in purely natural terms. So to consider them spiritualists, I think that they're actually very good objective researchers who have tried. Van Lommel as well. they have tried to look at these experiences, do really good studies on actual people and patients, and come along. But this article presents the spiritualists as if, oh, these are people who aren't into the science. Where I'd say, no, I think if you're going to call them spiritualists, and then there are the parapsychologists who are not really religious
Mhm.
believers necessarily, but a little more new agey perhaps. And so they've tried to do some research on it. And then you got the physicalists who come out in this article as the heroes who are really looking for physical explanations for it. But to me, it admits that these are in the minority. These are not the people that have been studying near death experiences. These are people who, seems to me, have had an experience with a patient where they were running some tests and they say, hey, maybe the brain keeps working after cardiac arrest and after death. So let's see what we make of this. But these have not been the main researchers. So I think there's a lot. They're kind of painting a picture of research as if you've got the wild-eyed people believing in an afterlife, but then you got the real solid scientists who are saying, no, 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 it's really just all physical. I
Yeah.
think that's a very inaccurate picture of the history of near-death studies, and especially if you read the Journal of Near-Death Studies, which started way back in the 1970s and has continued to today. That's telling you where the research is.
Well, and I don't appreciate them trying to paint this picture that it's like for every researcher you find going in and looking into near death experiencers or near death experience and trying to prove essentially near death experiences are a supernatural phenomenon. There's the equivalent on the other side that have equally as good of evidence proving that it's not a supernatural phenomenon. Like for example, um, I was trying to find this spot where he quotes Susan Blackmore, who wrote her book I think in 1990, which was essentially railing against near death experiences. And he says at the very least, Parnia and his colleagues have written such the phenomena being the near death experiences are inexplicable through current neuroscientific models. Unfortunately for the parapsychologists, however, none of the reports of post death awareness holds up to strict scientific scrutiny. Okay. So that term I think immediately paints this incredibly broad brush to be like lots of the scientific community writes this off, right? Because it doesn't hold up to the strict scientific scrutiny. Quote, and then he's quoting Susan Blackmore here. There are many claims of this kind, but in my long decades of research into out of body and near death experiences, I've never met any convincing evidence that this is true. So, like Susan Blackmore is using her own opinion to determine what is or isn't true. It's not like she's saying an objective it is this objective point that can be met, and she even debates with Jordan Peterson on this later on Unbelievable about the consciousness of the mind. But a well-known researcher into parapsychology who had her own near-death experience as a young woman in 1970, and specifically she commentates on that case, Steve, where the lady, I can't remember her name, has the near death experience. She has an OBE as part of this near death experience, and she sees the shoe on the ledge a few stories
Right.
up and above. And when she points that out, right, the nurse goes up and actually finds the shoe. So she verifies this as a corroboration that she verifies that the shoe was found. And so therefore it makes us believe, okay, there's really good evidence to believe she was out of her body. And then in this instance, she says the case of the shoe, Blackmore pointed out, relied solely on the report of the nurse who claimed to have found it. That's far from the standard of proof the scientific community would require to accept a result as radical as that consciousness can travel beyond the body and exist after death. And I think for me, it's like they get to, I feel like in it, they get to assume that their views of consciousness are the correct ones and that all the evidence has to prove their views are incorrect. When it's like, you guys haven't done any work to prove that your view is correct. So why should we accept that as the standard? So again, it's this kind of it's this battle of presuppositions, but
There's the assumption that the atheists are the objective ones. So, yes, these are not, to Susan Blackmore, there's not sufficient evidence that things have been going on outside of the body. Well, she's a committed atheist. She
yeah,
was a committed atheist before she started studying all this.
she's a
So, why should I
materialist.
take her word on it? Also, this would be considered a straw man argument because you take one bit of evidence, which may be weak, and it's been a while since I studied out the shoe on the ledge thing. I know that people debated it back and forth. Go to Susan Blackmore. I mean, that's the one. The Susan Blackmore case is the one that was the best documented. If you're going to see somebody who was actually hooked up to all the machines to see, is there any heartbeat, is there any breathing, is there any brain activity, and they actually could show that, when we talked to the surgeon, Dr. Spitzer, and others who were involved. Dr. Sabom did a tremendous amount of research, and Dr. Sabom is really a tremendously objective researcher. You can see that in his books. But you've got the Susan Blackmore case. Deal with that and not the shoe on the ledge one. When you dismiss a whole area of research and say, oh, there's not really been any evidence that these people are outside of their bodies, and you use that, I mean, that's a perfect example of a straw man argument. Or go to Sabom's first book, where it took him about a year to decide that, wow, these cardiac patients were actually out of their bodies because of their descriptions of what was going on in the operating room and around the hospital during a time when they were clinically dead. So he dealt with the doctor's notes, the hospital records, interviewed people. Very good study. But they don't deal with any of that. They just take a straw man argument and then say, hey, look, here's the real scientific evidence. People's brains were working after they were dead. And that's their big
You're referring
argument
to
here.
Pam Reynolds, not Susan Blackmore, right?
I am so sorry. Pam Reynolds is the person I'm speaking of, the Pam Reynolds case.
So to help you guys understand what I just had Steve correct was we were rebutting basically Susan Blackmore as the esteemed scientist who was basically rejecting near-death experience, and Steve was saying, don't choose these easy cases to throw out by simply saying, well, this is just one person's testimony. I mean, how much weight can we really put on one person's testimony, which is a conversation to be had. He was saying, go to Pam Reynolds' case where you have lots more evidence you're going to have to make sense of before you can just simply write it off. And that's what he's saying to Susan Blackmore. Go and engage with those cases to begin with before you start going down towards some of the cases that have fewer lines of evidence for them.
So the author of this article really just doesn't go in and deal with the evidence on the other side. And it's pretty, as someone said, it's pretty easy for near-death experiences to look purely naturalistic if you don't look at any of the supernatural elements. And that's what they refuse to do in this article, apparently, or weren't aware of, is all the good studies showing that people were apparently in some type of afterlife or out-of-body consciousness during their experiences.
And Steve, this part irritates me too. So let me bring up the last part of this section, because again, I think this section really reveals the whole hand of the author. So he finishes up commenting on Susan Blackmore, and then he says, the parapsychologists tend to push back by arguing that even if each of the cases of veridical near-death experiences leaves room for scientific doubt, surely the accumulation of dozens of these reports must count for something. But that argument can be turned on its head. If there are so many genuine instances of consciousness surviving death, then why should it have so far proven impossible to catch one empirically?
And I'd say Pam Reynolds is one of the best that we captured empirically.
Well, and what does he mean by that?
Like, Sabom had a whole cast of people, and Van Lommel as well.
But like, what is the empirical evidence he's like? What does he want? Does he want us to go to heaven and get some sand and come back and be like, check out my heavenly sand? Do you want to test this in a lab? It's like, it's the old argument, Eric Hernandez, I've heard him use this one, and it's funny. I always make fun of it, but now I feel like it's kind of catching on, which is he talks about a guy going to a beach and he's using a metal detector to find plastic, right? And so we would refer to this as a category fallacy when you're arguing, right? And so he goes to the beach and he goes, well, I hit the whole beach with this metal detector and there wasn't a single thing of plastic out there. And I'd be like, well, obviously you're using the wrong tool or the wrong methodology to get to the point of plastic. And it's the same thing here. It's like, what do you mean empirical proof of the afterlife? I think Like, he doesn't fundamentally understand that it's like this whole argument is about understanding if there's a world outside of the material world. And therefore, science can't necessarily commentate on the thing in which supernatural things are made of. It would be like, what's the scientific proof for truth, right? What's
Well,
that?
in the same way, and so what do you mean by empirical evidence? For example, you'll see scientists all the time talking about the nature of what the sun is made of and what certain planets are made of and all. They've never been there. If your idea of empirical is you've actually got to go there and bring a sampling from the interior of the sun or the interior of the earth, you can't do science. But what we do is we gather evidence for what should be there. And that's what they've done in the case of near-death experiences is we've looked over all these hours of interviews or talks that we've had. We've looked at the evidence, and that's what we've tried to gather. So, and much of this evidence is empirical in the sense that we're dealing with doctor records, and we're dealing with just the way someone would work with a legal case, scientific evidence applied in the legal system. So I think it's very empirical. It is certainly empirical to the people that have experienced it because they're claiming to have actually seen and touched and heard all these things on the other side, and it was the most vivid experience ever. Super empirical, I would say.
Well,
So maybe we ought to hit
yeah.
the we really haven't hit the main argument here is that you have people who have died and yet there is latent brain activity. They're saying because of this, therefore this probably explains near-death experiences. But the first premise is that this has actually happened, that you've got uh, clinical death, and even after the clinical death, cessation of heartbeat, cessation of breathing, there is this, in fact, not just latent activity in the brain, but almost supercharged activity in the brain. And that's what this other article responds to. Did you have any initial responses to that? I think that's their main argument, so I'd like to address that.
I'm sorry, Steve. I was engaging with this. I was trying to find the EEG readout of patient one because I wanted to cross collaborate that with a claim that they made in the Guardian. Could you give me the
So
question
we're
one time?
referring here to, and there are responses because this so-called evidence came out years ago, and you can look in the Journal of Near-Death Studies where they do some responses as well from Bruce Grayson and others. But
Mm.
this article is called Head Truth. I think if you search that, and it's Wednesday, April 3rd, 2024, The Guardian's misleading story on near-death experiences.
Oh, you
Now,
printed it out. Okay.
why I like this article is that it is very well documented and actually gives, like Charlie's looking for, what were the actual reports from the EEGs that were, that were proving that there was the activity afterwards. Now, what they showed, I think, very well in this was that this was not a state of clinical death like you have in a when a heart actually stops. You see, that's what Sabon was studying, is people whose hearts had stopped and they were a cardiac arrest and they were no longer breathing. Okay, so these people had seen things during that time. Susan Blackmore's would be an example of this. But what this article is saying is that when they went back and looked at the original records that the people from The Guardian were quoting from, that actually these weren't people who had experienced clinical death. These were people who had had maybe they were on life support, at least one of them was on life support, and they pulled the plug.
Mm-hmm.
Now, after they pull the plug, they would start probably gagging a little or stop breathing. And also the heart is kind of trying to restart itself. It's not had cardiac arrest where the heart is completely stopped. The heart's still trying to pump. And after each of those beats where it tries to pump again, there's a little bit of activity in the brain, which is exactly what would be expected. in a case like that. So it was not clinical death. It's not brain activity after clinical death. This is something that when the heart is still trying to start itself and there's a little bit of latent activity there, obviously not enough to start consciousness because they were not physically conscious there.
Well, and he says in the article, which I thought was incredibly misleading, was that
Which article? The Head Truth
I'm sorry, I'm
or the
referring to the Guardian right now, the Guardian's
The
article,
Guardian? Okay.
right? Is he says in the moments after patient one was taken off oxygen. So again, they're saying patient one is a case, a groundbreaking case, because when they take her off of life support, suddenly all this brain activity explodes. And so it's probably safe to assume that because this brain activity was such high quality brain activity, that it's safe to associate a near death experience with all of this brain activity. Now, they don't know that for sure, right? They're just assuming that this brain activity means that that's what's happening, right? So we're making this leap, right? Which is like, okay, fine, sure, I can grant some of that and say, sure, we're making that jump. So after
But it's
patient,
certainly not empirical
no, it
evidence
is
that they're
not. No, it is
having
not,
a
right?
near-death experience. It's just a suggestion that maybe it happened.
Yeah, it's like, oh, there's brain activity when they're dying. That must be the near death experience that we've heard so much about, which anyway, so there was a surge of activity in her dying brain. This is after patient one was taken off the oxygen. Areas that had been nearly silent while she was on life support suddenly thumbed with high frequency electrical signals called gamma waves. In particular, the parts of the brain that scientists consider a hot zone for consciousness became dramatically alive. In one section, the signals remained detectable for more than 6 minutes. In another, they were 11 to 12 times higher than they had been before the patient one's ventilator was removed, which she was unconscious, right? So, and in the EEG report that he pulls, and bear in mind, when he pulls this EEG report, notably at second 9 or 10, brain activity pretty much drops off. Like it's gone. Like and he goes and he actually pulls their EEG reports to kind of back up that statement of like, all right, you guys said that. Let's see the empirical evidence you're referring to, and then the empirical evidence doesn't prove that.
Right.
And in Mark's article on the head, so now I'm referring to the rebuttal article written by Mark, he notes that he's like, they're so desperate to basically prove their point that they're looking for the tiniest little notches of activity on these EEGs to say, there it is. That's the near-death experience right there. There's your proof, right?
And they used confusing terminology, some specialist terminology when they're talking about like the convergence of all these parts of the brain. It seemed like he was saying that really the convergence meant that all these different things happened at the same time, but it's no storm of brain activity like is implied by their wording. So you have to look into their wording as well and then compare that to the actual charts of what was going on with the EEGs.
Well, and I think what's notable is also that he goes back and he pulls the reports of the original rat report that they had done in. So the Guardian cites, I can't pronounce the doctor's name that he's referring to, Borgen. I'm so sorry. I know I murdered that. It's probably like a Swedish name or something. So Borgen, we're gonna go with that name for now. Borgen's initial introduction to this was doing a study into rats, and so they basically killed off rats to see kind of the brain activity that would happen. And so they noticed in the rats that there was like a spike of brain activity a second or so after death, and then basically no more activity. And so they thought that, okay, we can see this in rats, so that must be what this near-death experiences must be. This is that it's this tiny episode of hyperactivity that happens post-death. But the problem is we have lots of evidence that defies all of that explanation. And I think that that's what's so important, is that the article doesn't engage with those cases. It engages with select few cases that are easily dismissible, and then kind of builds from there.
And people like Dr. Sabom and Dr. Van Lommel, they are experts on what happens at cardiac arrest, and so they'll have whole entire chapters. And sure enough, at clinical death, it may take a few seconds before brain activity ceases. So we would expect when a rat dies or is killed that there's going to be some latent brain activity for a few seconds afterwards. And again, it's not like they experienced probably a cardiac arrest, and so the heart is still dying and having little spasms as it goes along. So the main point of this article is that this supposed brain activity after cardiac arrest shows that near-death experiences could be happening there, and that could explain them. But the problem is it's not really showing anything except what near-death researchers have been saying all along. That number one, this was not clinical death. And number two, at clinical death, very quickly the brain activity drops off. And these people, in their experiences, some of them claim to have experienced their entire lives in their life reviews. And so that happened in just a few seconds of declining brain activity. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
So this is a very incomplete
That
article
that
dealing
that's
with this.
also something I had a question about, Steve, was this idea that, let's say I grant that, okay, great, you've proved that everybody's brain goes hyperactive for at max 10 seconds post their death, right? That still doesn't explain the time distortion aspect of it all. I mean, that part, I feel like that part I'm having a hard time wrestling with, I suppose, is the idea that all of these events are happening in a collapsed amount of time, and it's, I think, we've spoken to this, that the structure of near death experiences isn't like a dream. You'd be like, well, it happens in your dreams. It's like, yeah, but your dreams feel rushed and discombobulated and kind of jumping in and out and just all over the place. There's no real good structure to a dream. There's no real start and end, structured start and structured end to a dream, whereas near-death experiences are always that way.
Now, I'll go back to that quote where the person said, near-death experiences can look pretty naturalistic as long as you ignore the seemingly supernatural aspects. So I've given like
Yeah.
12 lines of evidence saying there are things that seem to fit more with the afterlife hypothesis than the dying brain hypothesis. Some of those are, just as Charlie mentioned, why is there, if what you're experiencing is a purely naturalistic thing that's informed by our expectations at death, perhaps, then why is there this consistent experience globally with people who have very different expectations at death? Why are atheists all of a sudden experiencing afterlife type things? This if okay, let's assume that there is a little bit of latent brain activity. Let's give her that, even though we've shown that this was not shown by the studies. Let's say there is some brain activity. Okay, how does that explain a consistent experience where we would expect a hallucinatory experience which would differ with everyone? How does it explain people who have unexpected elements like the distortion of time that Charlie mentioned? The distortion of, it's the inability to fully explain what's going on, when if it were just a hallucination, it would be drawing from elements that are explainable, or like we have dreams.
Yeah, great point. Great
Why,
point.
and then
Great point.
other points, basically also, these are not near-death experiences they're talking about if they happened. This is a deathbed vision, actually, would be what they're talking about, because this is a person's final death
Yeah, they're not
from
coming
which
back
they
from
don't
it.
recover. So
Mhm.
really, we're dealing with deathbed vision research, which the people at Cambridge University who did the British census, they showed that people who were perfectly healthy, whose brains were not dying, were seeing these individuals who had died in some spiritual form, either at or after their death in a distant location. Well, you can't explain that with the dying brain if these people's brains are not dying,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
It does nothing to explain shared death experiences where somebody's at the bedside of someone is dying and they experience some of these things. So all these supernatural elements remain unexplained, even if they're right about some latent brain activity after clinical death.
Right, and that's like, basically what you're saying there is introducing new information. Most near-death experiences or deathbed experiences will typically introduce some type of new information into someone's life. So to simply say that it's like their brain hyper activating and then using previous data to reconstruct a comforting reality, right? That's basically what
Right.
they're trying to posit is like your brain is dying, it wants to comfort you, so it takes all these good memories and it creates something with that, right? But
Right.
that
Right.
doesn't
Right.
explain the introduction of new information that's showing up from the reported near death experiences, like seeing new places, seeing people changed in different variations of reality itself. So I think that that's also a big jump of like, okay, cool. Now that we have this brain activity, and I guess in their defense, right, to kind of steelman their position, they would be like, well, we're not saying that. We're not saying we have all the answers. We're just simply saying this might be the first step in providing a naturalistic explanation of these experiences. I'm not telling you I can explain this new information that shows up. What I'm telling you is that I can find brain activity on a scale and then show you this brain activity and say, okay, well, this brain activity could very well be your near death experience that you want to say is proof of the supernatural.
Good point. And I think too, there's this assumption that naturalists are open-minded and scientific, and people who believe in spiritual explanations for things are just all touchy-feely and not really dealing with the science. But at some point in people's articles, when they argue for a naturalistic position, like Susan Blackmore, she says in the very kind of introduction, she'll say, well, obviously, science tells us that there's no afterlife, that when you
Yeah.
die, you die.
Yeah.
And I say, no, wait a minute, you hadn't even looked at it yet. And you're saying that this is the obvious scientific position. I disagree with this. People that were studying them, Moody and others, were very well trained in the sciences. And how can you just say that it's so obvious? Kevin Nelson, in his book, The Spiritual Doorway in the Brain, he acts so scientific. But then towards the end, he says, this is the most extraordinary claim in all of science that people are 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 alive, consciousnesses are alive after death. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, he just thinks it's ridiculous. Then you look at the end of the New Science of Death article in The Guardian, and he says, last couple of paragraphs there, he says, meanwhile, in parts of the culture where enthusiasm is reserved not for scientific discovery in the world, but for absolution or benediction in the next, the spiritualists, along with sundry other kooks and grifters, oh my goodness, we're kooks and grifters, okay, Charlie?
Mm-hmm.
Along with sundry other kooks and grifters, are busily peddling their tales of the
The afterlife. Yeah.
afterlife.
Yeah.
So
Saw
that
that.
makes me see that, okay, this person has already put believers in the
Yeah.
afterlife in the category of kooks and grifters
Yeah. I
and
noticed that
non
too.
scientific. And so, what will a person like that think of the evidence? Just like Susan Blackmore, they're saying, well, that's not enough evidence for me.
Well,
Well, what type of evidence would it take to convince a person like that? Probably nothing, would
mm-hmm.
convince them because they've already made up their minds, which is not very scientific. You're not objectively looking at the data of almost 50 years of near death experience research to see what's been found.
Well, and that's really the case, right? Is can you honestly say you were going in and looking at the research objectively if you weren't open to the idea of it objectively leading you to the supernatural? I think
And I think there's evidence in a lot of these articles that they're not.
there. Well,
They're not
it's
being objective.
well, and they always have this like incredibly dismissive and insulting tone to conclude it of it's almost like this intellectual superiority complex that they always seem to have expressed in the tone of the article and like in that paragraph you just read, forget the proverbial tunnel of light. In America in particular, a pipeline of money has been discovered from death's door through Christian media to the New York Times bestseller list and thence to the fawning gullible armchairs of the nation's daytime talk shows. First stop Paradise, next stop Dr. Oz. So it's like there's just hidden within that. There's this very intellectual superiority of you guys are basically all getting got, right? You guys are getting a facade pulled on you and you can't tell this through objective reality. You can't tell because you are not scientific. You don't have the scientific mindset, right? But I would go further and I'd say, well, there's a lot of things that like science can't prove the statement that science is the only means by which to acquire truth. And so you have to start at philosophy before you can even kind of get to the scientific point. And then my question becomes, okay, so what is your arguments for saying that the supernatural isn't possible? Because there's no objective scientific evidence for it. But it's, again, I guess I'm trying to allude at this kind of circular argument that's just like, it doesn't really address the real point. And you can't honestly say that you're open to the evidence if you're not open to all the potential lines where the evidence could say. If you go into near-death experiences and you say, well, we know that there's not an afterlife, so we got to prove. And that's also the doctor's motivation, because he notes the doctor's motivation in there, the doctor who actually conducted the research. And they also had a materialistic worldview where they were saying, okay, hey, obviously this afterlife thing's not what's going down, right? It has to be some kind of physical phenomenon. I just need to figure that out. And so it's like they start with that presupposition and then they set out to prove it, where it's like, the researchers that you've mentioned, Steve, and why we have so much respect for them is they start out saying, I don't know if it's just this, or I don't know if it's actually something supernatural, but I tell you what, I'm going to do this research and I'm going to be open to wherever the evidence takes me. That is a way more objective outlook on how to approach the evidence than coming into it and saying, well, there's definitely no way there's the supernatural, so we just need to find a physical explanation, right? To kind of make sense of it all. And so, of course, they're going to bite down on the first thing they find, which is we have brain activity. We have brain activity after death. And now that makes sense of everything, because obviously there's no other explanations on the table.
Yeah, and it's really amazing. And it's okay to get kind of emotional about it, because after all, they called us kooks and grifters.
Yeah, basically called us idiots. That was a nice way of calling us idiots, for sure.
Oh my goodness. But I'd read, if you can tell objectivity in the writing of someone. If you look at Sabome's first book where he was researching this, he just didn't believe the stuff, okay? But he goes into it and he slowly just kind of like C.S. Lewis said about his testimony. He was pulled into theism kicking and screaming, right? You can see that in Sabome's book. He really didn't want to. I was talking to him the other day, and he said, I just thought it was hogwash. This moody stuff, it was hogwash. It was crazy. So he went in to study it. You read his book, and it's not a popularly written book. He's just going through and saying, okay, now what about this patient? Should I believe what they're saying? Well, let's go to the hospital records. Let's go to the doctor's records. Let's check it out. Van Lommel's, his was published in the Lancet, okay? But then he wrote the entire book on it. Very carefully done. And people like Bruce Grayson, his book After, which just came out in the last few years, his whole book is organized around him checking out all the naturalistic explanations for near-death experiences. And he put a lifetime of research behind it, working in academia, the Division of Perceptual Studies at University of Virginia. Very great intellect. But to call these people, put them all in the category of kooks and grifters who are trying to prove the afterlife, it really shows that what Thomas Kuhn talked about in his book on scientific revolutions, that a lot of people resist the scientific revolutions not because of evidence against them, but because they are psychologically, emotionally committed to another worldview. And in this case, I'm seeing many people who are emotionally committed to scientific naturalism, and they just can't see outside of that box.
And that's not to say that what they're saying is untrue. You know what I mean? That's just because they want it to be true or not to be true doesn't necessarily mean that their evidence is bad. It's just the evidence is bad. Period. Like it's just
we just need to keep going back to the evidence. And that's why I'm glad that we have naturalists giving their comments. We need to look at what they're saying, because all of us have worldviews. And we have to be careful of that. So I'm glad that we've got people writing there and looking at near-death experience research through the lens of their worldview. as long as we're all trying to be objective and understand that we've got the pull of our worldviews, I think we can get at more objective conclusions.
Yeah, I think that's probably what disappoints me the most sometimes is when we're interacting with these critiques and these arguments against the position. It's so disappointing to see them interact with such a very weak straw man version of it. Like it's not even they didn't attempt to make it as strong as they possibly could and go and engage with the strongest forms of the argument. They kind of just very quickly do this hand waving aspect of it all and then say, okay, cool, we can explain this, and then just move
Well,
on from it.
right. I mean, this is 2024. 2025 will be 50 years of near-death studies, starting if you start it all with Moody's writing Life After Life, 1975. The good thing about this point in near-death studies is that there have been great summary articles written. Missouri Medicine put together a group of articles in their very respected journal, put together in a book about the afterlife. You've got the Handbook of Near-Death Experiences, which, I don't know, 10 years ago or so, pulled together the first, no, it would have been 20 years ago because they pulled together, I think, 30 to 35 years of research. Here are the summary articles of what's been studied so far. So all someone has to do when you found something interesting, like latent brain activity after somebody pulled the plug, go back to the summaries of the studies that have been done after by Bruce Grayson. That's a good summary of a lifetime of research on that. But what I find consistently is the naturalists seemingly refuse to deal with the 50 years of research.
Mm.
They just want to go off a different direction, act like this never happened.
Hmm.
It's like they're allergic to the research that's been done. And rather than saying, okay, this research has been done on anoxia or whatever, and this is why I don't agree with it, they just don't even look at that summary of research.
Mm-hmm. I agree.
It
I
says
agree.
something about the way our minds work, and we need to all be careful of looking at the facts and things around us solely through the lens of our worldviews and our prejudices and what we want to believe. We need to keep checking ourselves on that. And that's why we interact with articles like this. And they may interact similarly to articles we write. I just want them to actually read them and deal with the evidence rather than making wholesale declarations of kooks and grifters.
Yeah. It didn't seem like a very objective way to finish off an article that tried to portray itself as extremely objective. Okay. Well, I think, ladies and gentlemen, that is enough of Steve and I engaging with this article for today. I hope you guys found that valuable, and like Steve says, sometimes we get very passionate about it, and it is what it is. It's the human experience, right? And so, but of course, as always, we want to steel man the opposing position. So if you guys heard us make any claims today or say something that's like, no, you guys missed this very important piece, please write it in the comments. We would love to engage with those positions in future episodes. So as always, if you found this episode to be a blessing, please send it to someone. That would be the greatest way to help us out. If you find the show interesting and this podcast interesting and you want to help us get it to the next level, just simply send it to someone you think would enjoy it. That's all we ask. So in the interim, we're going to say God bless, and we're going to see you guys in the next episode. So see you guys next time.